steps. So that's the question that has provoked my book. That is the title. And that gentleman is Franz Jagerstatter, beatified by the Catholic Church almost exactly 15 years ago. His story is really the inspiration for the book. But here's the quote from St. Augustine, one of the kind of founders of the Christian Catholic just war tradition, that I think has been around for centuries, and I don't think anybody's ever taken it seriously until my book. The wise man will wage just wars, for unless the wars were just, he would not have to wage them. And in such circumstances, he would not be involved in war at all. So what I'm suggesting is that there is a just war argument for the elimination of war. And I'm going to try to spell that out. Now, to quote another great Catholic luminary, Thomas Aquinas, he says that there are two reasons why men especially deviate from justice. The first is because they defer to important persons, authority.
Sorry. We are not seeing it go through the slides. I have pulled it up and I will screen share it if you want to move yours down. I will go through.
Okay.
You are on. There are two reasons why men especially.
Yes, that's where we need to be.
Deviate from justice.
Can we enlarge that? Do we need to enlarge
that?
Yes.
Here, let me remove this and make this one large.
Oh, different fonts. Oh, well.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
And can I control things from here, or do you need to do that?
Yes, I will go through the slides. Just say next.
Okay. So two reasons why men commit and women commit injustice. First is because they defer to authorities, and the second is because they defer to the majority. They conform. Okay, next. So Franz Jagerstatter, you see his birth and death dates there, was an Austrian farmer with only an 8th grade education. He was conscripted into the German army and eventually refused to serve, was court-martialed, convicted, and guillotined on August 9th, 1943. His story was almost forgotten, but it was discovered, and as I said earlier, he was beatified by Benedict XVI 15 years ago. I cannot and may not take an oath in favor of a government that is fighting an unjust war. And that may be his last written words. So he was offered appointment as a medic, that would not involve killing, but then he discovered he would still have to take an oath of unconditional obedience to Hitler by name. And he says, no, I cannot do that. And so he was killed. Next, please. So this is Gordon Zahn, who wrote a very important book, published in 1962. He was a sociologist, taught at University of Massachusetts, Boston, I believe. That book was German Catholics and Hitler's War, in which he just dissects the hierarchy's complicity with those wars. None of them, 30 or 40 of them, spoke out against the war. The best any of them did was to remain silent. In the course of researching that book, he discovered the story of Franz Jagerstatter, and a few years later published a biography. Gordon Zahn is one of the founders of Pax Christi USA, was himself a pacifist during World War II and spent time in a CO camp. Next, please. And he said this, Jägerstätter did. Those who want to find the right way to eternal well-being should not walk with the majority of people who are usually timid about making sacrifices, and they should not entrust themselves to leaders whose actions differ from their words. That should sound familiar to you. Next slide, please. So he's basically quoting Aquinas, though I don't suggest he ever read Aquinas' commentary on the book of Job. An 8th grade education. He was an avid reader. He never mentions how he learned about the Just War tradition. Next, please. And he said this also, which begins to tell us how he summoned up the wisdom, the courage, the perspective to take the stance that he did. We are expected not only to offer sacrifice, but also to attack, rob, and even murder people so that a national socialist world empire will come about. Nevertheless, people who decide not to obey the state's commands are accused of doing something seriously sinful. Wouldn't it be worthwhile to learn from the lives of the saints so that we would know how the first Christians would have responded to today's evil commands? So for Franz, the one true church was the church of the martyrs and saints of the early centuries, and they were his authority, not the bishops of his own church. Next, please. So what? Well, as this slide suggests, that World War II was the deadliest human-caused event in history. And the very fact that nobody's pinned down the exact number of deaths in a way that other people can agree with, other researchers, somewhere between 70 and 118 million deaths in that 6-year period. So it's worth talking about why that happened and what the alternative is. Next, please. So I'm not going to assume, I suspect this audience is quite sympathetic to Jägerstätter, but just as a matter of argument, I'm going to assume that some people think that Jägerstätter was wrong. There should be that in the slide too. For some reason, the font's changed. Jägerstätter was wrong because Hitler's wars were right and just. He was mistaken. Very few people would think that today. Next, please. Jägerstätter was wrong, even though Hitler's wars were unjust, because a citizen must serve his country right or wrong. He was unpatriotic. Next, please. Jägerstätter was wrong because it is wrong to disobey lawful authority, as said in Romans 13. He was disobedient. Next. Jägerstätter was wrong because he had no authority or expertise to make such a decision. He was incompetent. Next. Jägerstätter was wrong because he betrayed his fellow citizens, especially those who accepted induction and risked their lives as soldiers on his behalf, or some would believe. He was a shirker. Next, please. Jägerstätter was wrong because he could have accepted induction and then avoided killing. He was imprudent. Next. Jägerstätter was wrong because he could have accepted induction as an unarmed medic. He was a purist. Next. And this is the one that my students were most sympathetic to. Jägerstätter was wrong because he left his wife without a husband, his 3 young daughters without a father, his widowed mother without a son, and all of them without a provider. He was selfish. Next, please. On the other hand, I presume the Catholic Church, certainly myself, thinks that Jägerstätter was right. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Even if he was right, because his solitary witness would make no difference, he was a loser. He wasted his life. And until Gordon Zahn discovered it, that was almost true. Next slide. On the other hand, here we are. Jägerstätter was right because he acted upon a sincere and well-formed conscience. He was true to the truth as he knew it. He wrote quite a bit, enough to form a small book, and it's all about the forming of his conscience. Next, please. Jägerstätter was right because Hitler's wars were wrong, and his church, his country, and his village were wrong in supporting Hitler's wars. He was courageous. Next, please. Jägerstätter was right because it is better to suffer injustice than to inflict it. He was noble. Next, please. Jägerstätter was right because it is wrong to swear unconditional obedience to any political authority, especially a tyrant. He was astute. Next, please. Jägerstätter was right because it is better to obey God than men, quoting from the Acts of the Apostles. His soul was at stake. Next, please. So I like to say that the example of Jägerstätter has made a difference in the Catholic Church. 1/4 of the population of the United States, 1/6 of the population of the world are Catholic. Has made a difference. And here's the very modest proof of it. This is from a document published in 2004 by the Vatican during St. John Paul II's reign. Conscientious objectors who out of principle refuse military service in those cases where it is obligatory because their conscience rejects any kind of recourse to the use of force, that would be the pacifist argument, or because they are opposed to the participation in a particular conflict, that would be selective conscientious objection, must be open to accepting alternative forms of service. So that is now the official teaching of the church. The U.S. bishops from the time of Vietnam up to the present have been promoting that, but I would guess most Catholics do not yet know about that. Next slide, please. So the Catholic Church has a very high estimate of the value of conscience. The church could not put it any more strongly than this from their own perspective. And this is quoting St. John Henry Newman from the 19th century. Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. And aboriginal here, I think, just means to emphasize original. Nothing more original than aboriginal. Next slide. But the complication is, I'm just quoting some scholars here who are reporting a well-known fact. The case for selective conscientious objection rests in large part on Aquinas' assertion that a person should always obey his or her conscience, even if there is a possibility of being wrong. A soldier who cannot in good conscience fight in a given war would be acting immorally if he or she nevertheless chose to fight, whether it be due to fear of punishment or any other reason. Aquinas did, however, add an important proviso: conscience needs to be informed. And the example of Jägerstätter is certainly clear on that. He was as well informed as anybody. Next slide, please. But this is not a brand new idea. Christine de Pizan was a highly educated aristocratic woman in Italy in the turn of the 14th, 15th century, and wrote a book on what we would today call military ethics. And here's what she had to say. Every man who quite properly wishes to expose himself to war should, before he becomes involved, be well informed of the nature of the quarrel in order to know whether the challenge is just or not. Let him inquire if this war has first been judged by competent jurists or lawyers, or whether it may be for the cause of defense. You should know that if the quarrel is unjust, he that exposes himself in it condemns his soul. That is exactly what Jägerstätter thought. Next slide, please. In the earlier presentation by Thad Crouch, he referenced the question, the concept of moral injury. I have a chapter on that. This is the cover of a famous book by a man who served in World War II and then became a professional philosopher, The Warriors, Reflections on Men in Battle. And in very modern secular language, he's says the same thing that did Christine de Pizan. There is a line that a man dare not cross, deeds he dare not commit, regardless of orders and the hopelessness of the situation. For such deeds would destroy something in him that he values more than life itself. Eternal salvation of your soul, something he values more than life itself, however you understand that. Next, please. Little promotion here. The quote at the bottom is from the foreword by a well-known Catholic peace activist. This chapter contains 5 portraits of warriors, one from World War II, as we just saw, 2 from Vietnam, and 2 from Iraq, and gives a definition of moral injury as distinct from post-traumatic stress disorder. Moral injury is its own thing, although it has some symptoms that are similar to PTSD. Next, please. So this is my kind of synthesis of some of the definitions of moral injury that are in the research literature. Moral injury in warfare is caused by a betrayal of what's right by legitimate authority, or an individual's perpetrating, failing to prevent, witnessing, or learning about an incident or its aftermath that violates deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. It'd be really helpful if we could get the full screen up here, Sarah.
Unfortunately, my PowerPoint subscription inexplicably lapsed this morning, so I have not had a chance to address that since the conference began. Yeah.
No, that's still, let me try this one more. No. So, in shorter form, moral injury is a violation of human life and rights, and what you can't see, I'm sorry, is presenting as anger, guilt, and shame. So you could get PTSD from being in a bad car accident, but unless you were at fault, you probably would not feel guilt or shame. You might feel some anger at the driver who was at fault. But moral injury, the symptoms are not only the nightmares and night sweats and all of that PTSD can bring on, but anger, guilt, and shame. And I demonstrate that in these 5 portraits of the morally injured in those wars. Next, please. So what really made this book come together was my reading of philosopher Jeff McMahon's book, Killing in War, from 2009. He's now at Oxford in England. And then a later article called The Prevention of Unjust Wars, which is where I get the title of my book. And he said this: we should agree that young people who are commanded by their rulers to risk their lives in order to kill others deserve moral guidance that we know they will not receive from those who seek to use them in this way. So there needs to be an alternative form of source of moral guidance. McMahon proposes an international court made up of experts, scholars, jurists, lawyers, historians, and so forth, who would study and issue statements on the justice or injustice of current wars as a way of helping to inform worldwide public opinion and presumably then resistance to the war. What I've done in the book is simply take that idea and bring it into a Catholic context. And I think there are very good reasons to do that, even though it's not addressed to everybody in the world, at least explicitly. Next slide, please.
Hold on one second. I'm going to share it in a different format.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. So, to die for one's faith, to be a martyr, is considered in itself a miracle. And in the Catholic tradition, one is canonized, declared a saint only after the proof of two miracles. So I'm suggesting that perhaps the second miracle needed for Jägerstätter's canonization could be that the Catholic Church of the 21st century take the Just War tradition in relation to personal conscience as seriously as he did. To Blessed Franz's ancient Church of the Martyrs could be added a modern court of Catholic moral authority that would issue judgments about potential or current wars. And then I quote another of my favorite saints, Oscar Romero: no soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God. And that thought is hardly unique to Romero. Next slide, please. This is a quite provocative statement. Ralph Potter was a Protestant ethicist at Harvard in the 60s and 70s, and wrote about conscientious objection to particular wars, or selective conscientious objection. And he had this to say: was true then, it is still true now, even though we do not have an active draft. Under existing law, unless one would be unwilling to fight against a new Hitler as a pacifist, one may be compelled to fight for a new Hitler. So there is no middle ground. You either refuse to fight in all wars, or you have to fight in whatever war you're ordered to. That's what my book is saying is the problem. Next, please. So you might be asking yourself at this point, is there any nation in the world that makes selective conscientious objection legal, that puts it within reach of people in their military? And I suspect some of you may be guessing what that one nation is. It's the only one I've learned about so far. Next slide, please. It's Germany. And I think the reason some of you might have guessed that correctly is that Germany basically started two world wars in the first half of the 20th century. And in their profound reflection on that later, at least one of the generals in the 50s said, our nation endured a massive slumber of conscience in those two world wars and in between. And that's the problem. That's the problem. And so Germany, in its post-World War II constitution, and then some of their high court pronouncements, has put in place the option of selective conscientious objection within their military. And they call it, under the German term, inner leadership or conscience. And the gentleman on the left is Lieutenant Colonel Jürgen Rose, from whom I learned all this in an excellent article. And he himself practiced selective conscientious objection. He was deployed to fight in Afghanistan and refused. He asked to be reassigned, and lo and behold, he was. He was not court-martialed. His conscience was respected. He was reassigned otherwise, and there was no consequences to his career, though I think he has since retired. Next slide, please. So the kind of sparring partner of conscience is authority. That's come up in the especially the Aquinas quote. So the case study I use in the book is Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, the famous Pentagon Papers, and particularly a commentary on them by Hannah Arendt, the great political philosopher. And this is what she said in summary: what caused the disastrous defeat of American policies and armed intervention in Vietnam was indeed no quagmire, but the willful, deliberate disregard of all facts, historical, political, geographical. More than 25 years, both Democratic and Republican administrations deceived the American people over a period of 25 years. And you want to say this is this is legitimate authority when they don't come clean to their own people who are fighting and dying in this war. Next slide, please. So why do wars continue to plague us? What can be done to prevent them? To come back to the original question. Next slide, please. So here's my elevator speech summary of the book. Catholic pacifists blame the just war tradition of their church for continuing wars. That tradition, they say, can be invoked to justify any war, and so it must be jettisoned. This book, this presentation, argues that the problem is not the just war tradition, but the unjust war tradition, according to which ambitious rulers start wars that cannot be justified, and yet warriors continue to fight them. For the last 8 months, we've been given an object lesson in this in Russia's hideous invasion of Ukraine. A lot of soldiers are refusing to fight, or fighting with poor morale, or leaving the country when they're conscripted. Who knows at this point how much of that is conscience and how much is personal protection, but I presume there's some conscience going on there. Next slide, please. The problem is that warriors are believed not to hold any responsibility for judging the justice of the wars they are ordered to fight. However unjust, a command renders any war, in scare quotes, just for the obedient warrior. This book argues that selective conscientious objection, the right and duty to refuse to fight unjust wars, is the solution. Next slide, please. Strengthening the just war tradition depends on a heightened role for the personal conscience of the warrior. And within my context, which is Catholic, that in turn depends on a heightened role for the church in forming and supporting consciences and judging the justice of particular wars, not just the occasional bishop, not even some ad hoc comments of a pope, but a formal process for judging the justice of particular wars, a court. Next slide, please. And so we're back to Franz. As I said, he's the inspiration for this book. I'm deeply grateful to Gordon Zahn for having discovered his story. If it were not for Zahn, we probably wouldn't know about Franz Jagerstatter, at least not in the way we do now. So that's the book in a nutshell. Let's have some conversation. And you can see my email there if anybody would like to write me.
If you would like to bring anyone up, you can request them. They can request to come on screen. It looks like there are a couple of people in the moderation queue. It's up to you if you want to take live questions.
Okay, so down the left hand, I get a couple buttons. Mm-hmm. One from Thad Crouch, and I hit that. He'll have.
Yeah, hit the plus.
Okay.
Whoops, where's my, oh.
Hi, Thad.
Hi there, I had the wrong camera on. Hey, Roger, as you know, I love the book. One of my questions was, you in the book, you go into detail about how the progression of the authority to refuse, participation in an unjust war, that at one point, Catholics were supposed to, do this if the leader said, or if the bishop or the pope said, and now it's been the individual Catholic can do this. Do you think that might lead to bishops being less likely to declare a war unjust? I think it's still very important for that to happen. And I know I'm wondering also if you'll say something about your idea for the international, more about that.
Yeah. My this is all speculation, of course. I'm not a church insider. But there are offices in the Vatican who attend to these sorts of issues. There are over 300 Catholic colleges and universities in the United States alone. There are experts in just war, in international law, in history, international relations, all of that. It would not be difficult for the U.S. bishops to put together the kind of court I'm speaking of from those resources. It would not be difficult for the Vatican to pull together a court of considerable number of people who have real expertise in these questions, who could deliberate among themselves and decide if they felt that a war was so obviously unjust that they could make a public statement about it. And then, I think individual bishops in their dioceses could take their marching orders from that as they see fit. Individual Catholics in and out of the military would hopefully be paying attention to that. And, Catholic Church is an international player. I don't think this would happen outside of international public opinion. I think it would influence international public opinion. And that I'm recommending this kind of thing, hoping for this kind of thing within the Catholic Church, does not by any means detract from what McMahon says about a completely secular court. It doesn't detract from a possibility that the Church of England would establish a court, that the Presbyterian Church of the United States would establish a similar court, and so forth. So got to start somewhere. It's the tradition I know, and it has been the primary carrier of the just war tradition from the early centuries up till today, and single most prominent promoter of selective conscientious objection, although I'm afraid that's not saying much at this point. Good question. Anastasia. And Dane.
Looks like I'm up first. So I had a question in the Q&A, which is basically, I think if you look, for example, at like Theodis's Divine Institute 620 or Apostolic Tradition 1690 to 12, or according to Rob Arner, basically any Orthodox pre-Constantinian document, that the early church actually seemed to be absolutists on the killing is always wrong. Indeed, they'd throw people out of catechesis if they joined the military. And I'm not saying where love your enemies is really anywhere in just war theory. In fact, it seems to me the obvious. How do you respond to the claim that just war theory is, in fact, both unbiblical and not apostolic?
There are records indicating that Christians, Catholics at that time, served in the Roman army as early as the end of the 2nd century. So there was maybe a period of 150 years where we have no record of Christians serving in the military. But as they became more numerous, even more prosperous, and as the Roman army changed, it became less of a problem to be in the military from a Christian point of view. And so I think you have to put in historical context the claim that the Catholic Church was early pacifist. They were a persecuted sect. Of course, they're not going to be serve in a military.
So I had a quickish response, which is you can presumably find evidence that just by default of people converting and other things. I'm sure you'd find records of early Christians practicing infanticide, but that's obviously not good as an argument for infanticide. And you'd also find records where they weren't told that they had to leave the military, but they were told they had to stop killing if they converted while in the military. So I'm not sure I would really buy that argument.
Well, I have a long essay that's supposed to be coming out where I go into some depth on that question. Uh, yeah, seems to me that if you want to make a pacifist argument as a Christian, you can't just rely on the historical record because it's mixed. There have always been pacifists in the church. I respect pacifists. I just am not convinced that that's the way to put any dent in the war juggernaut. My father-in-law was a conscientious objector in World War II, spent time in a camp, a government camp. I have enormous respect for that decision. But I don't think, and unless you can address people's concern for defending themselves against aggression, that we have any way to persuade people that war is just not part of the scene. And when I started thinking about selective conscientious objection as a way of putting teeth in the just war tradition, I think it's a big dream. It's at least as big a dream as the pacifist dream. Began to think that this deserves to be laid out as thoroughly as I can do it, and I hope other people will contribute to the discussion about how it might come to be.
Probably.
Anybody else?
Roger, thank you so much. I think you can take one more question. I think we're about to have another session start in about a minute. So, well, maybe negative a minute.
How did you present myself? Can someone kick me out?
Oh, yes. Remove. Thank you to everyone for being here. I posted your information for your book in the chat.
Great, thank you.
Please, I am really interested. I had not heard of your book before the conference, but I think I will look it up because I have an interest in this.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a book by a German priest, Stratman.
Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too.
Nope. Okay. It looks like.
Oh, Carrie, I was.
All right. So I am going to click out of here and make sure the other sessions are going to start happening. But if anyone else has any further questions, you guys can talk about them.
Okay. Yeah, or email me if you're willing to do it that way. Happy to respond to any concerns.